Boston, December 1st, 1852, 2 a.m. The fire starts without warning. Within the hour, the largest piano factory in the United States is gone. Walls collapsed, roof caved in, one police officer dead in the rubble. The flames are still visible across the harbor when Jonas Chickering walks into the wreckage, coatless, breath fogging in the winter air. He looks at what 30 years of his life have become, ash and twisted iron. He turns to his foreman and says, "Build it back. Bigger." 1 year later, a new factory rises on Tremont Street. So vast, so imposing, that newspapers call it the largest building in America outside the United States Capitol itself. 400 workers, steam-powered machines, fireproof walls of Boston brick. Jonas Chickering never walks through its doors. He dies 8 days after the building is completed. 55 years old. A stroke. Gone. This is the story of Chickering and Sons, a company that dressed Abraham Lincoln's White House in music, put a piano on the stage the night he was shot, and built the instrument that made Henry Steinway's hands tremble with envy. And then lost everything anyway. He was not a musician. That is the first thing you need to understand about Jonas Chickering. He did not grow up playing sonatas in a parlor. He did not come from money, or from culture, or from the kind of Boston drawing rooms where a grand piano sat in the corner like a piece of inherited furniture. Jonas Chickering was born in 1798 in Mason, New Hampshire, the son of a farmer, raised with tools in his hands before he could read sheet music. When he first encountered a piano, he did not sit down to play it. He took it apart. He wanted to know how it worked. That instinct, the instinct of a builder, not a performer, would define everything that followed. At 17, Chickering left New Hampshire and made his way to Boston, the cultural capital of a young nation still figuring out what it wanted to be. He apprenticed with a cabinet maker named John Osborne, learning to shape wood, to feel the grain, to understand the difference between a joint that holds and a joint that merely looks like it holds. It was in Osborne's shop that he first encountered the piano trade in earnest, not as an instrument of art, but as a problem of engineering. How do you build a wooden box that produces sound powerful enough to fill a concert hall? How do you keep it in tune when the strings exert thousands of pounds of tension against a frame that wants to warp and crack? These were the questions that kept Jonas Chickering awake. By 1823, he was 24 years old, restless, and ready. On February 15th of that year, he signed a partnership agreement with a piano maker named James Stewart and opened a small shop on Tremont Street, not far from where he had apprenticed. The sign above the door read, "Stewart and Chickering." The first year, they produced 15 pianos. 15. In a country where demand was thin, competition was scarce, and most American families who wanted a piano simply imported one from Europe. 15 instruments represented not a business so much as a declaration of intention. Jonas Chickering intended to change things. Stewart did not share the vision. Or perhaps he shared it, but lost patience with the pace. 4 years after the partnership began, James Stewart dissolved it and left for London, abandoning the American market entirely. He would never return. Chickering was 28 years old, sole owner of a small but increasingly respected workshop, and entirely alone. What he had, though, was a reputation. In a city that prided itself on discernment, word had already spread among Boston's musicians and music teachers that the young man on Tremont Street built instruments of unusual quality. His pianos held their tune. Their keys responded with precision. The woodwork was clean and tight in the way that only comes from someone who understands wood at a structural level, not merely an aesthetic one. By 1829, output had climbed to 47 instruments a year, not a fortune, but proof of concept. Inside the workshop during those years, Among the apprentices and craftsmen who drifted in and out, there was a particular type of worker Jonas valued most. The German-trained craftsmen who had begun arriving in Boston from the workshops of Hamburg, Stuttgart, and Berlin. These men brought with them techniques that American piano makers were only beginning to learn: precise voicing of hammer felts, careful calibration of action mechanisms, an almost obsessive attention to the relationship between string tension and soundboard resonance. One such craftsman, a young man who had crossed the Atlantic with little more than a set of chisels and the name of Chickering's shop written on a scrap of paper, arrived in the late 1820s. He spoke broken English, worked without complaint from first light until the lamps were lit, and quickly earned a reputation on the shop floor for the quality of his hammerwork. He would spend the next 4 decades inside these walls. He would watch the company rise to the pinnacle of American industry, and he would watch it begin, slowly and then suddenly, to slip. But that was still far away. In 1829, Jonas Chickering was looking forward, not back. He had a workshop, a reputation, and a growing conviction that the American piano industry was not a niche. It was a frontier. What he needed was capital. What he needed was a partner who could move product, who knew ships and trade routes and the appetite of markets he had never visited. What he needed, in other words, was someone completely unlike himself. He was about to find exactly that. Captain John Mackay did not look like a man who belonged in a piano factory. He was a sea captain by trade. Broad-shouldered, weather-worn, the kind of man who measured distance in nautical miles and negotiated in the currencies of a dozen port cities. He had made his fortune moving cargo across the Atlantic and down the coast of South America, and he understood markets the way sailors understand wind, not as something to be controlled, but as something to be read and used. When Mackay walked into Jonas Chickering's workshop on Tremont Street in early 1830, he was not looking for a hobby. He was looking for an investment. What he found was a craftsman sitting in wood shavings, sketching modifications to a piano frame by lamplight. The partnership they formed that year was one of the most unlikely and most consequential business arrangements in American industrial history. Chickering brought invention. Mackay brought everything else. Under the name Chickering and Company, the two men divided the world cleanly. Jonas stayed in Boston and built pianos. Mackay loaded them onto his ships and sold them to the parlors and concert halls of South America, returning with his holds full of something far more valuable than money. He brought back wood, rosewood from Brazil, mahogany from the Caribbean, timber so dense, so fragrant, so perfectly grained that the craftsmen in Chickering's workshop would pause when a new shipment arrived, running their hands along the planks the way a jeweler handles uncut stone. American piano makers of the era worked largely with domestic woods, serviceable but limited in their acoustic properties. The exotic hardwoods Mackay sourced gave Chickering instruments a tonal richness that competitors simply could not replicate. You could hear the difference the moment the keys were struck. The sound did not merely fill a room, it occupied it. Output climbed steadily. 50 pianos a year, then 100, then several hundred. Boston was beginning to understand that it had something in its midst, not merely a manufacturer, but a maker of objects that belonged alongside the finest instruments produced anywhere on Earth. And then Jonas Chickering made the move that separated him from every other piano builder of his generation. In 1837, after years of experimentation, he secured a patent for something that seems simple in retrospect, but was, at the time, a radical departure from accepted practice: a single, full-length cast iron plate, integrated directly into the piano's structural frame. Every piano before this moment had relied on a wooden frame to bear the tension of the strings. Wood is beautiful. Wood resonates. Wood also warps, cracks, and drifts out of alignment under the enormous pressure that piano strings exert. Sometimes thousands of pounds of tension concentrated across a structure no larger than a dining table. Iron does not warp. Iron holds. Chickering's iron frame meant that a piano could be strung to higher tensions, producing a bigger, more powerful sound. It meant the instrument stayed in tune longer. It meant that the grand piano, previously a luxury that required constant maintenance, could be sold to people who did not employ a full-time tuner. Today, every piano in the world is built this way. Every single one. The iron plate is not a feature. It is the foundation. And Jonas Chickering put it there. By 1839, John Mackay's son William had joined the partnership, and the firm briefly operated under the name Chickering and Mackay's. It was a period of expansion, confidence, and momentum. The workshop on Tremont Street had grown into something approaching a real factory floor. Craftsmen stationed at specific tasks, a division of labor beginning to take shape, steam-powered machinery supplementing the hand tools of the older workers. Production was rising faster than anyone had projected. Then the sea took everything. In 1841, Captain John Mackay set out on what should have been a routine voyage to South America, the same route he had traveled dozens of times, the same ports, the same trade. He never arrived. No wreckage was found. No survivors. No explanation. John Mackay simply vanished into the Atlantic, and the partnership that had transformed Chickering and Company into the most dynamic piano manufacturer in America dissolved not in a boardroom, but in the silence of an ocean that gave nothing back. Chickering did not pause to grieve, or if he did not do it publicly. He moved immediately. He mortgaged the factory, bought out the Mackay family's shares at fair value, and assumed full ownership of the operation. It was an act of financial courage that bordered on recklessness. He was carrying the entire weight of the company alone, against debt, in a market that had not yet proven it could sustain what he was building. But he had seen what this company could become. And somewhere in a workshop, filling with the scent of Brazilian rosewood and iron filings, the German craftsman set down his tools at the end of a long day, looked at the half-finished piano before him, and wrote a single line in a letter home to Stuttgart. "I think I will stay. T." E.T. Barnum understood one thing above all others. Americans did not just want entertainment. They wanted to believe they were witnessing something that would never happen again. In 1850, he found exactly that. Jenny Lind was 29 years old and already the most famous singer in Europe, a Swedish soprano whose voice critics described in terms usually reserved for natural phenomena. She had performed before royalty, been praised by Chopin, reduced entire concert halls to silence with a single sustained note. She had never set foot in America. Barnum, who had never heard her sing in person, offered her $200,000 for a tour of 150 performances. She negotiated him down to 93. Then Barnum turned to Jonas Chickering. He needed an instrument worthy of Jenny Lind. Not a standard concert grand pulled from inventory. A purpose-built piano, constructed specifically for the demands of a national tour that would carry it across stages from Boston to New Orleans, through the heat of southern summers and the rattling of railroad carriages. Chickering accepted the commission without hesitation. The craftsman in the Washington Street workshop understood the assignment. This was not a piano. It was an ambassador. When Jenny Lind arrived in New York Harbor on September 1st, 1850, the city lost its mind. 30,000 people lined the docks. Hotels were overwhelmed. Sheet music bearing her portrait sold out within hours. Barnum, who had spent weeks orchestrating every detail of her arrival, watched the crowds from a distance with the satisfied expression of a man who had lit a fuse and stepped back to admire the explosion. The opening night concert in New York was sold at auction, tickets fetching prices that working men could not earn in a month. The tour opened in New York, where the Chickering Grand sat at the center of the stage like a declaration. From New York, it moved to Boston, then swept south and west across the continent. 93 performances, 93 nights with a Chickering name visible to every person in every hall. It was the most effective marketing campaign in the history of American piano manufacturing, and it was not designed as marketing at all. It was simply the best instrument for the job. But something else happened on the opening night in New York. Something that would take a decade to fully reveal itself. In the audience, pressed among the wealthy and the fashionable, sat a German immigrant who had arrived in America just weeks before Jenny Lind. He was 53 years old, had spent his entire working life building pianos in the workshops of Brunswick, and had come to New York with his sons to start again in a country he barely knew. His name was Heinrich Engelhard Steinway. He had already begun the process of anglicizing it. Soon he would be Henry Steinway. He had come that night not for the music. He had come for the piano. When the concert ended, Steinway did not leave. He pushed forward through the departing crowd toward the instrument on the stage, running his hands along the case, pressing the keys, listening to the sustain, examining the iron plate with the concentration of a man taking an examination. The ushers asked him to step back. He did not step back. He had to be, in the account that passed into industry legend, physically redirected away from the instrument before the hall could be cleared. He had seen enough. He had seen that Chickering had solved problems he was still working on, and had solved them in ways that pointed directly toward the next generation of instruments. He would spend the next several years building on what he had studied that night, refining and ultimately surpassing it, transforming his own New York workshop into the company that would, within a decade, push Chickering from its throne. But in 1850, none of that had happened yet. In 1850, Jonas Chickering was at the height of his powers. The Jenny Lind Tour ran through the following year, each performance a reminder to American audiences that the finest piano on earth was made in Boston, Massachusetts, by a carpenter's apprentice from New Hampshire, who had once produced 15 instruments in a single year and called it a start. Production at the Washington Street factory had climbed toward 1,000 pianos annually. The waiting list for a Chickering Grand stretched months into the future. Inside the workshop, the German craftsman who had arrived more than 2 decades earlier was now training the next generation of hammer makers. His English still accented, but his authority absolute. He had seen the company double, then triple, then double again. He had watched Jonas Chickering move from craftsman to industrialist without ever, in his observation, losing the craftsman's instinct for what was true and what was merely adequate. He trusted Jonas Chickering. He trusted the work. He had no reason to believe that trust would be tested so soon. On the night of December 1st, 1852, 14 months after Jenny Lind's triumphant American debut, 2 years after Henry Steinway had stood transfixed beside a Chickering Grand, someone inside the Washington Street factory smelled smoke. By the time the alarm was raised, it was already too late. The fire began sometime after midnight. No one ever determined the exact cause. Investigators spoke of a spark from the boiler room, an unattended lamp, a careless moment in a building full of wood shavings, lacquer, and dry timber stacked to the rafters. Some suspected arson. The factory was insured, the timing was convenient, the damage was total. Most concluded it was simply what it appeared to be, an accident in a building that had been asking, for years, to burn. By 2 a.m, the Washington Street factory was gone. The walls did not just catch fire, they collapsed inward, sending cascades of burning timber into the adjoining structures, which caught in turn, the flames spreading down the block in both directions before the fire companies could contain them. One police officer, responding to the alarm, was killed when a section of the outer wall gave way without warning. Dozens of half-finished pianos, Instruments that had been days away from completion, representing months of skilled labor, were reduced to carbon and wire. Jonas Chickering arrived before dawn. He stood at the edge of the wreckage in the December cold, watching the embers die, and said almost nothing. The men around him, foremen, craftsmen, workers who had run from nearby boarding houses when the alarm bells sounded, waited for some sign of what came next. Jonas Chickering looked at 30 years of his working life reduced to ash and twisted iron, and then he turned away from it. He was already thinking about what came next. Within days, the decision was made. He would not rebuild on Washington Street. The site was compromised, the neighborhood shifting, and Jonas Chickering was not a man who rebuilt the same thing twice. He had always understood that the only direction worth moving was forward. He engaged an architect named Edwin Payson and gave him a set of requirements that, by the standards of 1852, bordered on visionary: a steam-powered factory, fireproof construction, enough floor space to house 400 workers simultaneously, and a design that announced, without ambiguity, that this was not merely a manufacturer's building, but the headquarters of an industry. Payson designed a massive Italianate complex on Tremont Street in Boston's South End, a neighborhood that was still developing, still becoming what it would be. The factory was built around a central courtyard, its rear wing housing engine rooms and a distinctive hexagonal smokestack that could be seen from blocks away. The brick walls were thick enough to contain a fire rather than feed one. The windows were tall and numerous, flooding the workshop floors with the kind of natural light that craftsmen require for close work. When the newspapers got their first look at the plans, they reached for the only comparison available. The factory on Tremont Street, they wrote, would be the largest building in the United States outside of the United States capital itself. Jonas Chickering read those words and went back to work. Construction moved quickly through 1853. By autumn, the building was taking its final shape, 4 stories of Boston brick rising above Tremont Street, the smokestack climbing above the roofline, the interior floors being fitted with machinery and workbenches, and the specialized equipment of a modern piano factory. Workers hired in anticipation of the opening began arriving from across New England and from Europe, swelling the rolls toward the 400 that Payson's plans had accommodated. Jonas Chickering visited the site regularly. He walked the floors with Edwin Payson, examined the placement of the machinery, conferred with his foreman about the workflow that would move a piano from raw lumber to finished instrument across the building's 4 levels. He brought his 3 sons, Thomas, Frank, and George, and walked them through each section of the building with the deliberateness of a man transferring knowledge he was no longer certain he would have time to transfer in other ways. He had not told anyone he was unwell. In the first week of December 1853, Jonas Chickering suffered a stroke. He was 55 years old. He died on December 8, 1853, 7 days after the 1-year anniversary of the fire that had destroyed his old factory, and just days before the new factory on Tremont Street was formally handed over for operation. He did not walk through its doors. He did not hear the machinery run or smell the fresh-cut rosewood stacked in its new lumber rooms or see 400 men take their stations in the building he had imagined from a pile of ash. He had built the largest piano factory in the world and never set foot inside it. The obituaries were fulsome and immediate. Boston's newspapers mourned him as an industrialist, a philanthropist. He had served as president of the Handel and Haydn Society, the country's oldest oratorio organization, for years, and as a figure who had, almost single-handedly, established American piano manufacturing as a serious enterprise on the world stage. In New York, the musical press noted his passing with the kind of respect reserved for men who had altered the shape of an industry. In the workshop on Tremont Street, where the machinery was being calibrated and the first workbenches being assigned, The German craftsman who had arrived more than 2 decades earlier put down his tools at the end of the day, sat on a wooden crate, and did not move for a long time. He had worked for Jonas Chickering for most of his adult life. He had trusted the man's judgment in materials, in design, in the particular and uncompromising standard that separated a Chickering piano from everything else on the market. He did not know Thomas, Frank, and George Chickering the way he had known their father. He would learn. What he could not yet know, what none of them could know, was that a German-born piano maker in New York had just incorporated a new company under the name Steinway and Sons, and was already building instruments that would, within a decade, make the entire industry reconsider everything it thought it understood. The throne was empty, the competition was coming, and the sons of Jonas Chickering were just beginning to understand the weight of what they had inherited. The factory opened in 1854 without ceremony. There was no ribbon cutting, no speech, no celebration. Jonas Chickering had died 3 months earlier, and his sons understood, perhaps instinctively, perhaps by necessity, that the moment called for work rather than pageantry. 400 workers filed through the doors of 791 Tremont Street on the first morning of production, took their stations, and began. The machinery started. The saws bit into fresh lumber. The smell of rosewood and lacquer filled the upper floors. Chickering and Sons was open for business. The 3 brothers had divided the company among themselves in a way that, for a time, worked with surprising efficiency. Thomas, the eldest, assumed overall management. Steady, methodical, the kind of man who read balance sheets the way his father had read wood grain, looking for the flaw before it became a failure. Frank, the middle brother, took the outward-facing role. Sales, promotion, relationships with concert artists and international distributors. He had his father's confidence without his father's introversion, and he understood that in the piano business, visibility was not vanity, it was strategy. George, the youngest, went to the floor. He studied the craft with the seriousness of a man who knew that the family name was only as good as the instrument it was stamped on, and for years, he took personal responsibility for making every set of hammers fitted to every grand piano that left the Tremont Street factory. Every set. By hand. It was the kind of detail that would have made Jonas Chickering nod in recognition. Quality was not a policy at Chickering and Sons. It was a practice. Daily, physical, unrelenting. Production climbed. The factory's 4 floors operated as a continuous process. Raw lumber arriving at the ground level, moving upward through the building as it was shaped, assembled, strung, voiced, and finished, emerging on the top floor as a completed instrument ready for tuning and inspection. The system was not assembly line manufacturing in the modern sense. Each piano still required the judgment of skilled hands at critical stages. But it was organized in a way that Jonas had begun, and his sons accelerated. A deliberate division of labor that allowed the factory to produce volume without entirely surrendering the standards of the workshop. By the mid-1850s, Chickering and Sons was producing more pianos than any other manufacturer in the United States. Presidents' wives played Chickering grands in the White House. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow kept one in his study. Concert halls from Boston to New Orleans specified Chickering as a matter of course. The name had become, in the vocabulary of American cultural life, synonymous with the instrument itself. And then, the country went to war. The Civil War arrived at 791 Tremont Street in an unexpected form. In 1860, with the nation fracturing along lines that would soon become battlefields, a company called the Spencer Repeating Rifle Company approached Chickering and Sons about leasing space within the factory. The arrangement that followed was one of the stranger chapters in American industrial history. For 8 years, from 1860 to 1868, The building that Jonas Chickering had designed as a cathedral of music also served as an armory. Spencer produced more than 100,000 repeating rifles for the Union Army within those brick walls, weapons that would be carried by soldiers at Gettysburg, at Chickamauga, at Cold Harbor, piano hammers and rifle stocks, rosewood and gunmetal, the same floors, the same smokestack, the same hexagonal outline visible from Tremont Street. The craftsmen on the upper floors continued their work through all of it. A Chickering Grand took no notice of the war below. The hammers were voiced, the strings were tuned, the cases were polished to a finish that reflected a man's face back at him when he leaned close enough to inspect the wood. War or no war, the pianos had to be right. On the night of April 14th, 1865, the night John Wilkes Booth stepped into the presidential box at Ford's Theater in Washington, a Chickering piano sat on the stage below. It had been there for the evening's performance. It was still there when the screaming started. History does not record who moved it afterward, or where it went. It records only that it was there, another Chickering, present at another moment when the country held its breath. The war ended. Spencer moved out. The factory returned fully to pianos. In 1867, Frank Chickering traveled to Paris for the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair that Napoleon III had organized as a showcase of global industry and culture. Chickering entered their instruments in competition against the finest piano manufacturers in Europe. They won. And at a ceremony that Frank Chickering would describe for the rest of his life as the single most extraordinary moment of his professional career, Emperor Napoleon III personally bestowed upon him the Imperial Cross of the Legion of Honor, one of the most prestigious non-military decorations in the world. Frank returned to Boston with the medal and said little about it publicly. The work continued. George made the hammers. Thomas read the balance sheets. But the balance sheets, by 1867, were beginning to show something that no medal from Paris could correct. From a workshop in New York, Henry Steinway had spent 17 years studying, refining, and quietly surpassing everything that Chickering and Sons had built. The man who had been redirected away from a Chickering piano in a concert hall in 1850 had spent nearly 2 decades building his answer. The answer was ready. Henry Steinway did not beat Chickering and Sons in a single decisive moment. That is not how markets shift. That is not how thrones are taken. What happened between 1867 and 1880 was slower and more painful than any single defeat. It was the gradual realization, quarter by quarter and concert hall by concert hall, that the ground beneath Chickering's feet had been moving for years without anyone inside 791 Tremont Street fully acknowledging it. Steinway's advantage was not simply the piano. It was the strategy around the piano. Henry Steinway and his sons understood something that the Chickering brothers, for all their competence, were slower to grasp. In the second half of the 19th century, the piano was not merely a musical instrument. It was a cultural object, a symbol of refinement, of aspiration, of a particular idea of what it meant to be a civilized American household. The family that owned a piano was not just making music, it was making a statement. And the company that controlled the cultural conversation around the piano controlled the market. Steinway moved aggressively into that conversation. They cultivated European concert artists with a deliberateness that went beyond endorsement into something closer to an exclusive relationship. Anton Rubinstein, the Russian virtuoso whose American tour in 1872 drew the largest concert audiences the country had ever seen, played Steinway. His hands on the keys were, in the marketing language of the era, proof of the instrument's supremacy. Where Chickering had relied on the quality of the piano to speak for itself, a craftsman's instinct, rooted in the belief that excellence was self-evident, Steinway understood that excellence needed a voice, and that voice needed to be the most celebrated voice in the room. the piano itself had also changed. Steinway's overstrung grand, in which the bass strings crossed diagonally over the treble strings rather than running parallel, produced a tonal depth and resonance that was genuinely different from the Chickering sound. Not necessarily better in any absolute sense, but different in the way that audiences of the 1860s and 1870s were beginning to prefer. Richer in the bass, more singing in the upper registers, with a sustain that seemed to linger in the air a half-second longer than you expected. Concert artists noticed, then critics noticed, then the public noticed. Chickering responded. They were not standing still. Frank pushed the company into new design experiments throughout the 1870s. Refinements to the action mechanism, adjustments to the iron plate geometry, new approaches to soundboard bracing. In 1875, they opened Chickering Hall in New York City, a 1,500-seat concert auditorium at 130 Fifth Avenue, designed by the architect George B. Post, a building so elegant that it immediately became one of the premier cultural venues in Manhattan. 7 years later, Oscar Wilde would stand at its lectern and deliver his first public lecture in America. The hall was not a factory building with a piano in it. It was a statement of cultural authority. But a concert hall requires programming. Programming requires artists. And the artists, one by one, were going to Steinway. Inside the Tremont Street factory, the German craftsman who had given the better part of his working life to Chickering Sons watched the shift, with the particular clarity of a man who builds things for a living and therefore has no patience for self-deception. He had been offered, through an intermediary, a position at a rival Boston manufacturer. He had declined, but he had also, in the privacy of his own judgment, done something that cost him several nights of sleep. He had gone to New York and played a Steinway grand from one end of the keyboard to the other. He sat at the bench for a long time afterward. The instrument was extraordinary. He could hear it, the way a craftsman hears, not as a listener receives music, but as a builder understands structure, feeling the resonance through the keys, reading the evenness of the action, sensing the relationship between the soundboard and the strings in the way a doctor reads a pulse. It was not better than a Chickering in the ways he valued most. The woodwork was not more precise. The iron plate was not more elegantly cast. But it spoke a different language, a louder, more immediately arresting language, and the concert halls of America were filling with audiences who had grown up hearing that language and now recognized it as the sound of quality. He went back to Boston and made the hammers. What else was there to do? Frank Chickering traveled to Boston's Tremont Street Hall and to New York's New Chickering Hall and continued the work of keeping the name visible, keeping the artists engaged, keeping the argument alive that Chickering Sons remained the standard against which all others should be measured. He was not wrong about the quality. He was simply fighting a cultural current that had begun to run against him. And cultural currents do not reverse because the argument on the other bank is technically superior. By 1880, Steinway & Sons was the dominant piano manufacturer in America. The gap was not yet catastrophic. Chickering remained profitable, prestigious, and capable of producing instruments that any honest critic would rank among the finest in the world. But the momentum had shifted in the irreversible way that momentum shifts when an industry's center of gravity relocates and the old center does not yet know it has been left behind. Thomas Chickering had seen it coming. He had watched the numbers with increasing unease through the final years of his tenure, pressing Frank for answers that neither of them fully had. In 1871, before the consequences became fully visible, Thomas Chickering died. He was the eldest brother. He was the one who had held the balance sheets together, who had provided the steady administrative hand that kept the company functional while Frank performed and George built. His death left a gap that was larger than it appeared from the outside. Frank picked up the weight. George kept making the hammers. But a company that loses its steadiest hand in the middle of a competitive crisis does not simply continue on course. It drifts, slowly, almost imperceptibly, in ways that no single decision captures and no single person is entirely responsible for. The craftsman on the factory floor noticed. He always noticed. Frank Chickering was the one who should have saved it. Of the three brothers, he was the most dynamic, the most creative, the most capable of operating simultaneously in the worlds of commerce and culture that the piano industry required a man to navigate. Thomas had been the administrator. George was the craftsman. But Frank understood something rarer than either administration or craft. He understood desire. He understood why people wanted things, what stories they told themselves when they opened a catalog, or sat down at a showroom piano, or wrote a check for an instrument that cost more than a working man earned in 6 months. Frank Chickering could look at a potential customer and know, within minutes, what that customer needed to hear. For a decade after Thomas's death, he held the company together through force of personality and genuine commercial intelligence. The 1870s were not a collapse. They were a rearguard action, skilled, disciplined, and for long stretches successful enough to obscure the underlying pressure. Frank pushed Chickering deeper into the concert hall business, understanding that the stage was the most powerful showroom ever invented. The New York Chickering Hall, which had opened in 1875, became one of Manhattan's premier cultural venues, an address that carried its own authority, independent of whatever happened in the piano market. When Franz Liszt, the most celebrated pianist in the world, declared that he preferred Chickering instruments for his American tours, Frank made certain every music journalist in New York knew it before the week was out. When the company won awards, and they continued winning awards, more than 200 over the course of the company's history, Frank ensured that each one appeared in the trade press, in the society columns, in the kind of publication that the wives of Boston merchants read over breakfast. He was fighting for the narrative, and for a time, he was winning it. Inside the factory on Tremont Street, the work continued at a pace that would have satisfied Jonas. The Chickering registers, the company's meticulous production ledgers, 51 volumes that would eventually find their way to the Smithsonian Institution, recorded every instrument built, every serial number assigned, every piano that left 791 Tremont Street for a parlor in Cincinnati or a concert hall in San Francisco. The numbers were still strong. The quality had not broken. George continued his hammer work with the same obsessive precision he had always brought to it, and the craftsmen on the upper floors maintained the standards that Jonas Chickering had established and that no competitive pressure had yet succeeded in eroding. But erosion does not always announce itself. Sometimes it works from underneath, in the places no one is looking. The generation of master craftsmen who had learned their trade in the 1840s and 1850s, men who carried in their hands and eyes an accumulated knowledge that could not be fully written down or formally transferred, were aging out of the workforce. The German craftsman himself, now in his 60s, was training younger men who were competent, careful, and entirely missing the particular intuition that only decades of close work on a single type of instrument can produce. He could teach them the measurements. He could show them the technique. He could not give them the 30 years of experience that told him, from the sound a hammer made when he pressed it against a string, whether the felt was voiced correctly or whether it needed another pass. That knowledge was leaving the building one retirement at a time, and no one had found a way to stop it. Frank understood this at some level. In the early 1880s, he made a series of decisions that reflected a man trying to hold together two things that were beginning to pull apart: the industrial scale the market demanded, and the artisanal standard the name required. He invested in new machinery while insisting on hand finishing at the critical stages. He expanded the sales operation while tightening the inspection process at the end of the production line. He was threading a needle that was getting smaller every year. In 1883, Chickering opened a new concert hall on Tremont Street in Boston, another 1,500-seat venue, another investment in the argument that Chickering was not merely a manufacturer, but a cultural institution. The hall was beautiful. It was successful. It was also expensive. And expense in the 1880s was a problem that the balance sheets were beginning to register in ways that Thomas, had he lived, would have read with alarm. The German craftsman retired from the factory floor in the mid-1880s after nearly 6 decades of working life spent almost entirely within a few blocks of this building. His hands, by then, showed every year of the work, calloused and slightly bent in the particular way that comes from decades of close manipulation of small, precise objects. He left behind a son who had grown up listening to his father's accounts of the hammer room, of Jonas Chickering's exacting standards, of the long days before the iron plate, and the even longer days after. That son had not become a piano maker. He had found other work, the way the children of craftsmen often do when the craft begins to feel like a closed world. But he had inherited something from his father that would matter years later in ways neither of them could have foreseen. George Chickering died in 1899. Thomas had gone in 1871. Frank had already preceded them both. He died in 1891 at the age of 62, having spent the last years of his tenure watching the gap between Chickering and Steinway widen in ways that energy and intelligence alone could no longer close. With Frank's death, something essential went out of the company. Not the name, not the factory, not the workers or the machinery or the 51 volumes of production registers that documented every piano built since May of 1823. All of that remained. But the animating force, the presence of a Chickering who genuinely understood both the instrument and the industry, who could hold the craftsman's standard in one hand and the cultural argument in the other, that was gone. The factory just hadn't admitted it yet. A company in decline does not always know it is declining. That is perhaps the cruelest feature of institutional decay, the way it mimics stability, the way the routines continue, and the invoices go out, and the pianos come off the production line, and everything looks, from a sufficient distance, like a business that is simply doing what it has always done. Chickering and Sons in the 1890s was still a prestigious name. It was still producing instruments that serious musicians respected. It still occupied the largest piano factory in Boston, still employed hundreds of craftsmen, still shipped instruments to customers across the country and overseas. But the momentum was gone. And in a competitive market, momentum is not a luxury. It is oxygen. The men who managed Chickering after Frank's death in 1891 were capable administrators without being visionaries. They kept the machinery running. They maintained the production registers. They honored the contracts and met the payroll and made the incremental decisions that kept a company of that size from tipping into immediate crisis. What they could not do, what perhaps no one could have done at that stage, was reverse the fundamental shift in the market's center of gravity that had been underway since the late 1860s. Steinway was the concert piano. Steinway was what the serious pianist requested, what the major halls specified, what the critics assumed when they wrote about a performance without bothering to name the instrument. Chickering was what Chickering had always been: excellent, principled, and no longer first. The company made one attempt in this period that stands apart from everything else, an attempt so unexpected, so contrary to the logic of a struggling manufacturer fighting for market share, that it deserves to be understood not as a business decision, but as something closer to an act of conscience. In 1905, Chickering and Sons hired Arnold Dolmetsch. Dolmetsch was an English musician and craftsman of Swiss origin, already well known in European musical circles as the leading advocate for the revival of early instruments: the harpsichord, the clavichord, the viol, the recorder. These were instruments that had been largely abandoned since the 18th century, displaced by the modern piano and the expanding concert hall repertoire that the piano made possible. Dolmetsch believed they deserved to live again. He had spent years building them by hand in London, performing on them, writing about them, arguing to anyone who would listen that the music of Bach and Handel could not be fully understood on an instrument that Bach and Handel had never touched. Chickering gave him a workshop inside the Tremont Street factory and told him to build. For 6 years, from 1905 to 1911, Arnold Dolmetsch worked inside the walls of the largest piano factory in Boston, constructing harpsichords and clavichords and violas da gamba, while hundreds of workers on the floors above and below him produced modern grand pianos by the hundreds. He was, by every account, entirely absorbed in the work. The instruments he built at Chickering during this period are now considered among the finest examples of early instrument reconstruction produced in the 20th century, held in museum collections on both sides of the Atlantic. Chickering and Sons was the only American piano manufacturer to support this work. Not one of their competitors invested a dollar or a square foot of factory space in the revival of instruments that predated the piano by 2 centuries. It was, by any rational commercial analysis, a peculiar allocation of resources for a company that was losing ground in its primary market. But there was another way to read it. Jonas Chickering had spent his life insisting that the piano was not merely a product. It was a contribution to something larger, to music, to culture, to the particular kind of civilization that a nation builds when it decides that beauty matters. The Dolmetsch project, whatever its commercial logic, was continuous with that belief. It was a company reaching back toward the reason it had been founded. In the years when it was becoming less certain, it remembered what that reason was. The son of the German craftsman, now himself a middle-aged man, working in another trade across town, heard about Dolmetsch through a former colleague of his father's. On a Sunday afternoon, he walked to the factory on Tremont Street and asked, through the front office, whether he might be permitted to see the harpsichords being built in the basement workshop. The request was granted. He stood in Dolmetsch's workroom for a long time, looking at the instruments, the curved cases, the delicate action, the strings running at angles that would have been unthinkable in a modern piano. He thought about his father, who had spent a working lifetime making hammers in this building, and who had always said that what separated a Chickering from everything else was not the machinery, but the intention behind it. On his way out, he paused at the door and told the young man who had escorted him that it was good work. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. In 1908, Chickering Sons was sold to the American Piano Company, a consolidation that merged 4 of the country's leading manufacturers into a single corporate entity. The Chickering name was retained. The factory continued to operate. The production registers kept their columns. From the outside, it looked like a transition rather than an ending. But the men who had worked inside 791 Tremont Street long enough to know what the place had been understood what the sale meant. The name would go on. Jonas Chickering's invention, the iron plate that every piano manufacturer in the world now used without acknowledgement or attribution, would go on. The building would go on. The thing that Jonas had built, though, the particular and uncompromising intention that had driven everything from the first 15 pianos in 1823 to the Dolmetsch harpsichords in the basement workshop of 1911, that had already been gone for some time. The factory just hadn't admitted it yet. The date was sometime in the spring of 1927. No single document records the exact day that 791 Tremont Street fell silent for the last time as a working piano factory. The production registers, Those 51 volumes of meticulous record-keeping that had documented every instrument built since May of 1823 do not mark the occasion with ceremony. There is no final entry that reads, "This is the end." The last Boston-made Chickering simply appears in the ledger like all the others, assigned its serial number, noted for its type and configuration, and then the column moves on to instruments that would be built somewhere else, by different hands, in a city the original craftsman had never visited. History does not always know when to lower the curtain. Sometimes it simply stops mid-sentence. But the men who worked on those floors on the last days of production knew. You always know. There is a particular quality to the final weeks of a place that has been alive for a long time. A heightened attention to ordinary things, a tendency to pause at moments that would not normally merit pausing, a collective awareness that what is happening for the last time. The workers at 791 Tremont Street had known for months that the American Piano Company, which had owned Chickering since 1908, had decided to consolidate operations. East Rochester, New York. A newer facility, more efficient, better positioned relative to the company's other manufacturing assets. The logic was sound. The logic was always sound when a corporation made this kind of decision. Logic did not make it easier to watch the machinery being unbolted from the floor. The process of dismantling a factory is, in its own way, as skilled a job as the work that factory performed. The large woodworking machines, the saws, the planers, the specialized equipment for cutting the curved shapes that a piano case requires, had to be disconnected from their steam and electrical lines, carefully lifted from their mounts, crated in timber framing that would protect them during the rail journey to New York State. Workers who had spent their careers operating this machinery now spent their final weeks disassembling it, packing it away with the same precision they had brought to everything else in this building, because precision was what this building had always demanded, and old habits do not stop at the factory gate. The lumber rooms were emptied first. The rosewood and mahogany and spruce that had been stacked and seasoning on the ground floor, wood that smelled, even after all these years, like the ships that had once carried it from South America, was loaded onto wagons and taken to the rail yard. The smell of it lingered in the empty rooms for days afterward. Workers passing through would stop without meaning to, drawn by something that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to memory. On the upper floors, the last pianos came off the line in the final weeks of production, finished, inspected, tuned, and shipped. Each one was a Chickering in the full meaning of that word. Iron frame, rosewood case, hammers voiced by hand at the final stage, the name stamped in the gold lettering that had appeared on the fallboard of every instrument the factory had produced since 1823. The craftsmen who completed them worked without rushing. They had been taught, most of them by men who had been taught by other men going back through decades of accumulated practice, that the last piano deserved exactly the same attention as the first. Some of them ran their hands along the finished cases before the instruments were crated. Not to check anything, just to touch them. By the final day, the factory floor had taken on the particular desolation of a place that has been emptied of its purpose, but not yet of its past. The machinery was mostly gone. The lumber rooms were bare. The workbenches that had lined the upper floors, long tables of scarred and stained wood, worn smooth in the places where craftsmen had rested their arms for decade after decade, stood where they had always stood, too heavy and too ordinary to be worth shipping to New York. They would be sold off in the weeks that followed, or broken up for firewood, or simply left until the building's next occupant decided what to do with them. Among the last workers to remain was the son of the German craftsman, now a man in his late 60s, who had come back to the factory not as an employee, but as a day laborer during the final weeks of dismantling, drawn by something he could not entirely explain. His father had worked in this building for decades. He himself had visited it as a boy, had stood at the edge of the hammer room and watched his father work with the focused intensity of someone performing a task that required everything he had. He had not understood then what he was watching. He understood it now. The foreman who would lock the factory that final evening was a Boston man who had worked at Chickering for 22 years. He had started as an apprentice finisher, working the final stages of case preparation under a senior craftsman who had himself been trained by one of the original German workers from the 1850s. He had worked his way through the building's hierarchy the way a man climbs a ladder, one rung at a time, each step earned rather than given, until he stood at the top of the craft hierarchy on the floor. He made one last walk through the building before he locked it. He went floor by floor, moving through rooms that were still large enough to be disorienting in their emptiness. Rooms where the noise of production had been so constant for so long that the silence felt like a physical presence, a new occupant that had moved in without being invited. On the third floor, where the action mechanisms had been assembled for as long as anyone could remember, he stopped at a window and looked down at Tremont Street. The hexagonal smokestack was still there, rising above the roofline. It would stay there long after everything else had changed. Some things are too solid to dismantle easily. He thought about Jonas Chickering, though he had never met him, knew him only from the portrait that had hung in the front office for as long as he had worked in the building, a formal likeness of a man with a craftsman's hands and a founder's expression. Jonas had died before this building opened. He had imagined it into existence from a pile of ash and then let his sons walk into it in his place. There was something in that which the foreman understood without being able to articulate it, the particular sacrifice of a man who builds something larger than himself and does not live to inhabit it. He picked up a single piano hammer from the floor, a stray, left behind in the clearing out, the felt still clean and the wood still sound. He turned it over in his hands. It was a small thing, dense and precise, balanced in the particular way that only a craftsman who has made thousands of them can achieve. Someone had made this hammer by hand. Someone had pressed the felt against the striking point and listened and listened again until the voicing was right. He put it in his coat pocket. He would find it there 3 days later and hold it for a long time before setting it on the mantelpiece in his front room, where it would stay for the rest of his life. He locked the front door of 791 Tremont Street. The key was large and iron, the kind that belonged to a building that had been built to last. He stood on the Tremont Street sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the facade. 4 stories of Boston brick, tall windows, the Italianate lines that Edwin Payson had drawn in 1853 for a man who wanted something that would not burn down. It had not burned down. It had stood for 73 years, through a civil war and 2 generations of competitive upheaval and the slow dissolution of everything that had given it its original meaning. 250,000 pianos had been built inside those walls, each one recorded in the production registers, each one carrying outward into the world the accumulated knowledge of craftsmen who had given their working lives to the proposition that a piano built in Boston should be the finest piano that money could buy. The building was empty now, but the brick was still there. The smokestack was still there. The worn depressions in the floor where the machinery had stood for decades were still there. Impressions left by weight and time that no amount of cleaning would entirely erase. Some marks, once made, do not come out. The foreman turned up his collar against the spring air and walked south on Tremont Street, away from the building, without looking back. Behind him, 791 Tremont Street stood in the early evening light, enormous, silent, and full of echoes that had nowhere left to go. For 46 years, 791 Tremont Street waited. It was not demolished. It was not repurposed in any meaningful way. It passed through the hands of several commercial tenants who used its vast floors for storage, light manufacturing, and the kind of anonymous industrial activity that leaves no mark on a building's identity because it never had any intention of belonging there. The Italianate facade weathered. The tall windows accumulated decades of grime. The hexagonal smokestack, that singular feature that Edwin Payson had designed in 1853 and that had been visible from blocks away when the factory was at full production, stood unchanged above the roofline, patient and slightly absurd, a chimney with nowhere left to exhaust. The south end around it was changing in ways that the neighborhood's earlier residents would not have recognized. The great Victorian row houses that had been built for Boston's prosperous middle class in the 1870s and 1880s had declined through the early 20th century into rooming houses, then into a density of poverty that the city's urban planners had spent decades either ignoring or making worse. By the 1960s, the South End was a neighborhood in the specific American condition that precedes either demolition or reinvention, run down enough to be affordable, intact enough to be worth saving, waiting for someone to decide which direction it would go. A girl growing up in Boston in those years might have walked past 791 Tremont Street 100 times without giving it a second glance. Just another large old building going slowly to seed, its past inaccessible behind decades of indifference and grime. But in 1973, a group of architects and urban planners looked at 791 Tremont Street and saw something different. They saw a building that had been built to last, massively constructed, structurally sound despite its decades of neglect, possessed of the kind of bones that cheaper construction never achieves. They saw floor plates large enough to accommodate artists' studios, ceilings high enough for sculptors working at scale, windows generous enough to flood a workspace with the northern light that painters have always chased. They saw a freight elevator, the original, built to carry the weight of assembled pianos and heavy machinery, that could move stone and steel and canvas with equal ease. They saw, in other words, a factory that wanted to be something again. The project that Gilded, Brunner, Kott, and Associates proposed was audacious by the standards of 1973, one of the earliest adaptive reuse projects undertaken in Boston, a concept that had barely entered the vocabulary of American urban planning. The idea was straightforward and radical simultaneously. Convert the old Chickering piano factory into live workspaces for musicians, artists, and craftspeople. Not luxury apartments, not commercial offices. Artists. The people who make things. The people who need space and light and the particular kind of silence that comes from thick brick walls and high ceilings. They would call it Piano Craft Guild. Construction began in 1973 and was completed in 1974. The architects made decisions that revealed a sensitivity to what the building had been. The freight elevator was preserved and reinforced rather than replaced, its industrial utility now serving the needs of sculptors moving stone rather than workers moving piano crates. The interior spaces were left deliberately unfinished at the margins. Exposed brick, visible beams, the worn depressions in the floor where the machinery had stood for 70 years left as they were, because covering them would have been a kind of dishonesty about what this place had been. The hexagonal smokestack stayed. Of course it stayed. In 1974, a 24-year-old sculptor named Clara arrived at 791 Tremont Street with 2 suitcases and a set of chisels that had belonged to her grandfather. She had grown up in Boston, had walked past this building as a child without knowing its history, and had applied for one of the new live work spaces on the strength of a portfolio that showed large-scale stone figures in various states of emergence, forms that seemed to be pulling themselves out of the material rather than being imposed upon it. She was assigned a studio on the 3rd floor. When she rode the freight elevator up for the first time, the same elevator that had carried assembled Chickering Grands down to the loading dock for decades, and stepped out onto the third floor. She stood for a moment in the unfamiliar space, taking its measure. The ceiling was high. The windows were tall and faced north. The floor was worn wood, scarred and stained by a century of industrial use, marked in places by the outlines of machinery that had been unbolted and removed 47 years earlier. She set down her suitcases and crouched to look at those marks more closely. They were clear once you knew what you were seeing. Rectangular depressions where the machine mounts had been bolted through the floor into the structure below, the wood compressed and darkened by decades of weight and vibration. Someone had stood in this exact spot every working day for years. Someone had made something here that was carried out into the world and placed in parlors and concert halls and presidential residences and put on the stage the night a president was shot. Clara did not sand the marks out. She moved her work table around them. She would work in that studio for 11 years. The stone figures she produced during that time, several of which entered museum collections, were made within the same four walls that had produced more than 250,000 pianos, had briefly housed the machinery of a war, had sheltered a craftsman who built harpsichords in a basement workshop as an act of institutional conscience. She did not know all of this history when she arrived. She learned it gradually, the way you learn anything about a place you have chosen to inhabit, through conversation, through curiosity, through the particular attentiveness that comes from spending long hours alone in a space that has a weight to it you cannot entirely explain. The building was trying to tell her something. She was willing to listen. This is how legacies actually work, not as monuments or plaques or the careful preservation of original materials behind museum glass, but as the continuation of a certain quality of intention from one set of hands to another. Jonas Chickering had built on Tremont Street because he believed that making something well, with the best available materials and the fullest available skill, was a form of contribution to something larger than the object itself. The craftsmen who followed him, the German workers and the Boston-trained finishers and the foremen who locked up at the end of the last day, had understood this without being told. Arnold Dolmetsch had understood it in his basement workshop. The architects who saw a ruined factory and imagined artists' studios had understood it. Clara understood it on the day she chose not to sand the floor. Outside on Tremont Street, the South End was changing again, returning, slowly and then quickly, to the kind of neighborhood its Victorian builders had imagined. The row houses were being restored, the corner cafes were filling. The neighborhood that had once housed the largest piano factory in America was becoming, once again, a place where people came to build lives that had something to do with beauty. At 791 Tremont Street, the brick was still sound. The smokestack still rose above the roofline, hexagonal and unhurried, as if it had always known it would outlast every argument about whether to tear it down. Inside, the building held everything it had ever held. The sound of 15 pianos being made in a single year by a young man who had taught himself a trade because no one had told him he couldn't. The sound of a sea captain's ships coming into harbor with their holds full of rosewood. The sound of Jenny Lind's voice and the hush of a concert hall full of people hearing something they would never forget. The sound of a fire, and then the sound of a decision made in the cold at 2 a.m. The sound of 400 workers arriving on a first day of production in a building their founder had not lived to enter. The sound of a war being manufactured on the lower floors while music was being made above. The sound of hammers being voiced by a craftsman who had crossed an ocean with a set of chisels and never found a reason to go back. The sound of a freight elevator rising. The sound of a chisel on stone, in a room where the floor still remembered the weight of the machines. Some things, once built, do not entirely come down.